The county recorder's office called me on a Tuesday afternoon to tell me that a woman who had worked behind that counter for 31 years took one look at my uncle's deed, set it down on the desk without even finishing her coffee, and said, "That's not Walter Voss's signature. I notarized his real one myself, more times than I can count, and this isn't it." I was standing in a soybean field 200 miles away when I got that call, doing an appraisal on someone else's land, and I remember having to sit down right there in the dirt, because I had spent 6 weeks bracing for a fight I wasn't sure I could win, and in one sentence from a stranger with a good memory, I suddenly understood that I already had. Before I tell you how we got to that phone call, let me take you back to where this actually started, because none of it makes sense without the years underneath it. If you've ever been the one in your family who quietly did the real work while somebody louder got the credit, stay with me on this one. If any part of this sounds familiar, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. And if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe, because there's a lot more to this story than a phone call from a county office. My name is Caroline Hollies. I'm 42 years old, and I work as a certified agricultural appraiser based out of Cedar Rapids, Iowa. My job, in plain terms, is to put an accurate dollar value on farmland, using soil surveys, yield histories, water rights, easements, and comparable sales, mostly for farm credit lenders deciding whether to approve a loan, and occasionally for estates trying to settle a fair division of property. I've spent almost 17 years learning to read land the way other people read faces, to know what a parcel is actually worth versus what someone wants it to be worth, and I've testified in more than a few contested estate cases where two sides of a family disagreed sharply about value, timing, or ownership. I mention all of this now because it matters later. I did not walk into this situation as someone unfamiliar with land records, deeds, or the particular kind of quiet fraud that sometimes happens when nobody expects a family member to check the paperwork closely. I grew up about 40 minutes outside Cedar Rapids, in a small town called Larkspur, and my family's farm, 340 acres of corn and soybean ground that had been in the Voss family since 1911, sat right on the edge of town, close enough that I could see the grain bins from my bedroom window growing up. My grandfather, Walter Voss, ran that farm for over 50 years, and it had been designated an Iowa Century Farm back when I was in middle school, a distinction the state gives to farms that have stayed in the same family for at least 100 years, and my grandfather was prouder of that little bronze plaque bolted to the fence post at the end of the driveway than he was of almost anything else he'd accomplished in his life. My grandfather had two children, my mother Linda and my uncle Roger, and from as early as I can remember, the two of them related to that farm in almost entirely opposite ways. My mother left for Cedar Rapids in her early 20s, married my father, and built a life that had nothing to do with row crops, though she never once stopped loving the place or visiting on weekends. My uncle Roger stayed. He took over more and more of the day-to-day operations as my grandfather aged, at least on paper, though the actual pattern, the one everyone in the family quietly understood but rarely said out loud, was that Roger managed the farm the way some people manage a checking account they know isn't really theirs, spending freely, borrowing against next year's harvest to cover this year's shortfalls, and relying, again and again, on my grandfather to absorb the difference. I was the one who actually worked that farm alongside my grandfather, starting the summer I turned 8, driving alongside him in the combine before I was tall enough to see over the dash without a booster cushion, learning to read soil moisture and grain markets the way other kids learn sports statistics. My mother would drop me off most weekends during the growing season, and I'd spend entire Saturdays walking fence lines with my grandfather, checking tile drainage, listening to him talk about crop rotation and the history of every field on that property, which ones had flooded in 1993, which ones his own father had cleared by hand in the 1930s. Uncle Roger, by contrast, was usually somewhere else on those weekends, and when he was around, it often involved some new venture he was excited about, a side business selling farm equipment, a partnership in a grain elevator 2 counties over, ventures that almost always required an infusion of cash from my grandfather and almost always ended within a year or two, quietly absorbed into the general silence that surrounded most of Roger's finank. Aisle decisions. I want to be clear that I never hated my uncle, and this isn't a story about a villain twirling a mustache. Roger could be genuinely warm, funny at holidays, generous in small ways when he had money to be generous with. The problem was never really his personality. The problem was a pattern, established over decades, in which my grandfather quietly protected Roger from the consequences of nearly every decision he made, while treating my own steady, unglamorous commitment to the farm as simply expected, background noise, rather than something worth acknowledging directly. I paid for my own soil science courses in college out of money I earned detasseling corn 3 summers running. I turned down a higher-paying appraisal job in Chicago in my late 20s specifically, so I could stay close enough to keep helping on the farm during planting and harvest, a decision nobody in my family ever seemed to fully register as a sacrifice, while Rogers' failed grain elevator investment, which cost my grandfather nearly $60,000, got quietly folded into family conversation as just Roger being Roger, an unfortunate but expected cost of loving him. My grandmother, Ruth Voss, passed away when I was 24, and after that, my grandfather leaned on me even more directly, not for farm labor exactly, since I'd moved into appraisal work full-time by then, but for the kind of steady presence Ruth used to provide, someone to sit with him on Sunday evenings, someone to help him keep track of paperwork he was increasingly less interested in dealing with himself. It was during one of those Sunday evenings, when I was 29, that my grandfather told me, in his usual understated way, that he wanted to talk to me about something important, and led me into the small office off the kitchen, where he kept his farm records in the same battered oak filing cabinet he'd used since the 1970s. He told me, sitting across from me at that desk, that he had been thinking hard about what would happen to the farm after he was gone, and that he had watched, for years, the difference between how Roger treated the land and how I treated it, and he didn't want 113 years of Voss family stewardship to end because the farm got divided or sold off to cover somebody's debts. He told me he had already met with an estate attorney in Cedar Rapids, a man named Paul Ostrander who specialized in agricultural succession planning, and that he had set up a revocable trust with the farm as its primary asset, naming me as sole successor trustee and sole beneficiary of the land itself, separate from the modest cash and personal property that would still be divided between my mother and Roger through his will. He asked me not to say anything to the rest of the family yet, not because he wanted to deceive anyone forever, but because he knew, the way people who have watched their own children for 60 years tend to know things, that revealing it too early would create pressure and resentment he wasn't ready to manage, while he still had years of farming left in him. I agreed, the way I think most people would agree, sitting across from a grandfather they loved, being trusted with something that large and that quiet. I didn't fully process, in that moment, what it would eventually mean to carry a secret like that for over a decade, watching my uncle continue to treat the farm as though it belonged, in some vague eventual sense, to all three of us equally, or perhaps more to him specifically, since he was the one physically present on the land day to day. I simply understood, sitting in that office with the smell of diesel and old paper in the air, that my grandfather trusted me with something enormous, and that I intended to honor that trust exactly the way he asked me to, quietly, without forcing a confrontation before it was necessary. The years that followed brought the pattern into sharper focus, now that I knew what I knew. Roger's cash flow problems continued, sometimes worse than others, and my grandfather kept absorbing them, refinancing equipment loans, covering a bad seed contract one particularly dry summer, quietly paying off a personal debt Roger had accumulated after a failed attempt at raising specialty hogs on 20 acres he'd converted without really running the numbers first. I watched all of this from a strange vantage point, knowing that the land underneath all of Roger's financial turbulence was already, legally, mine to inherit, and choosing, again and again, to say nothing, partly out of respect for my grandfather's wishes and partly, I'll admit, because some part of me still hoped the family would eventually see the disparity clearly on its own, without my needing to produce paperwork to prove it. If you've ever carried a piece of knowledge in your family that you knew would change everything the moment it came out, and chose to hold on to it anyway, out of love or fear or both, type, I understand. ND in the comments, because I think more people carry that kind of weight than we usually admit out loud. My grandfather's health began declining noticeably about 4 years ago. A slow decline at first, some trouble with his knees that kept him out of the fields, then a heart diagnosis that required medication and eventually a pacemaker. Then, in the last year of his life, a series of small strokes that gradually took more of his sharpness than any of us wanted to watch happen. I drove out to Larkspur most weekends during that stretch, sometimes midweek too when I could manage my appraisal schedule around it. And Roger, to his credit, did step up physically during those years, handling more of the actual farm labor as my grandfather became less able, though the financial patterns underneath remained largely unchanged. Debts quietly building, decisions made without much long-term planning, my grandfather still, even in decline. Occasionally writing checks to cover shortfalls, Roger never fully explained. My grandfather passed away this past February, in his sleep, at 86 years old, at the farmhouse he had lived in for over 60 years, which was, I think, exactly the way he would have wanted to go, in the house his own father had expanded, on land his family had worked for over a century. I was the one who found him that morning, having driven out the night before after a phone call from Roger saying Dad seemed unusually tired and wasn't eating much, and I remember standing in that quiet bedroom, sunlight just starting to come through the curtains, understanding all at once that the trust he'd set up 13 years earlier was no longer a distant, theoretical arrangement, but something that was about to become very real very quickly. In front of a family that had no idea it existed. The funeral was held 4 days later, at the same small Lutheran church in Larkspur where my grandparents had been married 61 years earlier, and the reception afterward took place at the farmhouse itself, in the same kitchen and living room where I'd spent so many Sunday evenings with my grandfather over the years. It was a good turnout, neighbors, extended family, men from the co-op he'd done business with for decades, and for most of that afternoon, the gathering felt exactly like what it was supposed to be, a genuine, warm send-off for a man who had been deeply respected in that small community for his entire life. I want to be honest that I wasn't thinking about the trust that day at all, not really. I was grieving, the way you grieve someone who shaped nearly everything steady and good about your childhood, and the last thing on my mind was legal paperwork. That changed about 2 hours into the reception, when Roger gathered a small cluster of family in the living room, my mother, a few cousins, a couple of aunts and uncles on my grandmother's side, and announced, with what I can only describe as careful, rehearsed emotion, that he had something important to share. He said that back in November, 3 months before Dad passed, Dad had come to him and said he wanted to make sure the farm stayed properly cared for, and that he'd signed papers transferring the farm to Roger directly, papers Roger said he'd been keeping quiet about out of respect for Dad's privacy while he was still alive. He pulled a folded photocopy out of his jacket pocket, a document dated the previous November, showing what appeared to be my grandfather's signature on a bill of sale transferring the farm's title to Roger for $1 and other valuable consideration, the kind of nominal value language sometimes used in family property transfers. The room reacted almost exactly the way you'd expect a grieving family to react, with relief more than suspicion, a sense that Dad had taken care of things before he passed, that the farm would stay in capable hands, that Roger, who had after all been physically present on that land for decades, was simply being formally recognized for a role he'd already been filling. My mother hugged him. A cousin said something about how relieved she was that there wouldn't be any messy fight over the property. I stood near the kitchen doorway, holding a cup of coffee I wasn't really drinking, and I felt something go very still and very cold inside me, not because I doubted, even for a second, that the document Roger was holding was fraudulent, but because I understood, immediately and completely, what it meant that he'd chosen this exact moment, surrounded by grieving relatives too raw to ask hard questions, to introduce it. I didn't say anything that afternoon. I want to be honest about that because I think people expect the confrontation to happen right there, in the living room, over a folded photocopy at a funeral reception, and that isn't what happened, and it isn't who I wanted to be in that moment. I finished my coffee, hugged people goodbye as they filtered out over the following hour, and drove back tea. Cedar Rapids that evening with both hands tight on the wheel, running through, with the same methodical focus I bring to any professional dispute, Exactly what I actually knew, and exactly what I needed to do next. The first thing I did the following morning was call Paul Ostrander, the estate attorney who had drafted the original trust with my grandfather 13 years earlier, and who was still, as it turned out, the attorney of record listed on the trust documents themselves. I told him what had happened at the reception, and he was quiet for a moment before telling me, in the careful, measured way attorneys deliver bad news softened by good news, that if the document Roger was showing people was dated last November, it directly conflicted with a trust my grandfather had established in 2012 and never revoked, and that unless Roger could produce something showing my grandfather had formally dissolved that trust before signing a new bill of sale, the November document, real or not, wouldn't actually override 13 years of clearly established legal intent. He also told me, more bluntly, that in his professional experience, family members who suddenly produce a conveniently timed document right after a parent's death, without any prior mention of it while that parent was alive, are producing forged paperwork more often than not, and that I should prepare myself for the possibility that this was exactly that. I asked Paul what I should do next, and he told me the same thing Marcus had told me in an entirely different situation years earlier, when I'd consulted him on a contested estate case for a client, which was to wait, gather everything I had, and let Roger's document face the kind of scrutiny it would inevitably face the moment he tried to actually use it for anything official, rather than confronting him directly right away and giving him time to refine his story or destroy evidence. I hated that advice in the moment, the way you hate any advice that asks you to sit quietly with something enormous, but I understood the logic, and I trusted it, because I had given nearly identical advice to clients myself more than once over the years. For about 5 weeks after the funeral, very little happened on the surface. Roger moved through the community as the presumptive new owner of the farm, and I watched, from a careful distance, as people at the co-op and the implement dealer and the local bank began treating him accordingly, congratulating him, discussing spring planting logistics as though the ownership question were already settled. My mother mentioned, during one phone call, that Roger had started talking about finally modernizing some of the older equipment, a new combine, an upgraded grain dryer, investments that would require serious financing, and I remember feeling a specific kind of dread settle into my stomach, understanding that Roger's plan almost certainly involved using the farm itself as collateral, which meant he was going to need that forged bill of sale formally recorded at the county recorder's office sooner rather than later, in order to establish clear title for a lender. That is exactly what happened. About 6 weeks after the funeral, Roger walked into the Marsh County recorder's office in the county seat, 20 minutes from Larkspur, and attempted to file the bill of sale to formally record the transfer of title, a routine administrative step that, under ordinary circumstances, happens without anyone examining the document too closely, since recorders' offices generally record what's presented to them rather than independently verifying signatures on every incoming filing. What Roger apparently didn't know, and what none of us in the family knew either, was that the woman working the recording counter that particular Tuesday afternoon was a longtime notary public named Doris Kessler, who had worked in and around that same courthouse for over 30 years, and who happened to have personally notarized the original 2012 trust document my grandfather signed with Paul Ostrander. Since Paul's office routinely used the courthouse notary services for larger estate filings back before his firm brought notarization fully in-house. Doris told me, later, when I finally met her in person, that something about the signature on Roger's bill of sale struck her as wrong the moment she glanced at it, though she couldn't immediately articulate what, and that her instinct, built over 3 decades of watching thousands of signatures cross her desk, was to pull the file on any prior documents associated with that same property before processing the new one. A habit she said she developed after a bad experience early in her career involving a fraudulent deed that had gone through without anyone catching it for nearly a year. When she pulled the county's records on the Voss Farm parcel, she found the 2012 trust filing, still on record, with my grandfather's actual signature attached from that TR. Transaction, a signature she remembered clearly, she said, in part because my grandfather had been a memorable man to work with, patient, dryly funny, the kind of person who always asked how her grandchildren were doing before getting down to business. Doris compared the two signatures side by side, right there at her desk, and the differences, once she was looking for them, were significant enough that she felt confident flagging the discrepancy immediately rather than simply processing the filing and letting the questions surface later. My grandfather, it turned out, had a very particular way of forming the W in Walter, a tall, angular stroke that came down hard and then swept back up into a small loop before continuing into the rest of his name. A quirk Doris said she remembered specifically because he used to joke with her, every single time he came in to notarize something over the years, that his handwriting teacher in the 1940s would be horrified by how he'd butchered the proper cursive form. The W on Roger's bill of sale was rounder, more conventional, missing that distinctive hard angle and loop entirely, the kind of difference that might look plausible to someone who'd only seen my grandfather's signature a handful of times. But that stood out immediately to a woman who had watched him sign his name in front of her at least a dozen times across 3 decades. Rather than record the document, Doris did exactly what a careful notary is supposed to do when something looks wrong. She declined to complete the transaction, told Roger the filing would need additional verification before it could be processed, and once he left the office visibly frustrated, contacted the county recorder directly to flag her concerns and ask what the office's standard procedure was for a suspected forged filing on real property. The recorder's office, in turn, reviewed the trust document on file and saw Paul Ostrander's name and contact information listed as the attorney of record, and someone from that office called Paul's practice that same afternoon, which is how, within about 3 hours of Roger walking into that building with his forged bill of sale, Paul Ostrander was calling me to tell me the entire situation had just cracked wide open, not because of anything I had done, but because of one notary's memory and one careful habit built over 31 years of watching people sign their names. I got the actual phone call from the recorder's office myself about an hour after Paul's call, since the trust listed me as successor trustee and the office wanted to confirm directly, from the party with legal standing, how I wanted to proceed regarding the flagged filing. That was the call, standing in a soybean field 200 miles from home, that I described at the very beginning of the story, a records clerk reading me, almost verbatim, what Doris Kessler had said at her desk that afternoon, and I remember the strange, floating clarity of that moment, the sense that 6 weeks of careful, patient waiting had just resolved itself in a single conversation I hadn't even been part of. I called Paul back within the hour, and we spent that evening on the phone going through exactly what needed to happen next. He explained that because the county had already flagged the filing as potentially fraudulent and declined to record it, we had a genuine window to act before Roger had any opportunity to try filing elsewhere or attempting some kind of workaround, and he recommended we move quickly to formally assert the trust's standing, request a forensic handwriting analysis comparing the two signatures through an independent examiner, and, given the seriousness of what appeared to be an attempted forgery of a deceased person's signature on a real property transfer, notify the county attorney's office as well, since this had moved well beyond a private family dispute into the territory of a potential criminal matter. I asked Paul, honestly, whether I actually wanted to go that far, whether there was a version of this where I simply asserted the trust quietly, kept the farm, and let the forgery itself go unaddressed as a matter of law enforcement, sparing my family and myself the additional strain of a criminal investigation layered on top of everything else. Paul told me that decision was entirely mine to make, that plenty of his clients in similar situations chose exactly that path, prioritizing family peace over legal consequences. But he also told me, gently, that forging a deceased parent's signature on a property transfer was not a small thing, legally or morally, and that choosing not to report it wouldn't make it not have happened. It would simply mean nobody outside the family would ever be held accountable for it. I sat with that question for 2 full days before deciding, and I want to walk you through how I actually got to my answer, because I think it matters more than the answer itself. I thought about my grandfather and what he would have wanted, and I don't think he would have wanted Roger sitting in a jail cell, not really. But I also don't think he would have wanted the truth simply buried to keep the peace, especially not a truth this specific, someone forging his actual signature on his actual land within months of his death. I thought about the difference between protecting my family and protecting my uncle specifically, and I realized those weren't actually the same thing, that the rest of my family, my mother especially, deserved to know the truth clearly rather than continuing to live inside a story Roger had constructed. And I thought, honestly, about the precedent, about what it would mean, going forward, if the lesson Roger took from this was that forging a document was a low-risk gamble, as long as the rest of the family preferred comfort to confrontation. I told Paul to move forward with reporting the matter to the county attorney's office, while also asking him to make clear, in whatever formal notifications went out, that I was not seeking criminal prosecution personally and would defer to the county attorney's own judgment about whether charges were appropriate, rather than pushing aggressively for the harshest possible outcome. That distinction mattered to me. I wanted the truth established clearly and formally. I did not want to be the architect of my uncle going to prison, even if the actual legal consequences ultimately ended up being serious. The next step was a meeting Paul arranged at his office in Cedar Rapids, about 10 days after the recorder's office flagged the document, with my mother, Roger, myself, and Paul present, along with an independent forensic document examiner Paul had retained, a soft-spoken man named Gerald Ambrose, who had spent over 20 years analyzing question documents for law firms, and occasionally, courts. I want to describe that meeting carefully, because it unfolded very differently than the family gathering after the funeral had, quieter, more procedural, and in its own way, more devastating for exactly that reason. Gerald began by laying out, on a large table in Paul's conference room, high-resolution copies of 3 signatures side by side, my grandfather's signature from the original 2012 trust document, his signature from a completely unrelated document, a farm equipment loan he'd signed 4 years before his death, included specifically to demonstrate consistency over time, and the signature on Roger's November bill of sale. He walked through, methodically and without any dramatic flourish, roughly a dozen specific characteristics: stroke pressure, letter spacing, the particular angle and loop in the capital W that Doris had noticed intuitively at her desk weeks earlier, the way my grandfather's signature consistently slanted slightly to the right with a distinctive downward pull at the end of the surname, none of which appeared in the disputed document. He concluded, in the flat, careful language of someone accustomed to being precise, because his opinions sometimes end up quoted in court, that in his professional assessment, the signature on the November bill of sale showed a probability of forgery high enough that he would be comfortable testifying to that conclusion if the matter proceeded further. I watched my uncle during that presentation more closely than I watched the documents themselves, honestly, because some part of me was still hoping, even at that late stage, that there might be an explanation I hadn't considered, that Roger might say something that made the whole situation make sense in a way that didn't involve him forging his own father's signature within months of his death. He didn't. He sat very still through most of Gerald's presentation, his jaw tight, and when Paul finally asked him directly whether he wanted to explain the origin of the document, Roger said, quietly, that he'd been under enormous financial pressure, that he genuinely believed Dad had intended to leave him the farm given how many years he'd put into working it, and that he'd made, in his words, a terrible decision out of desperation, a few weeks before the funeral. When he realized the trust existed and understood, for the first time, that he was about to lose the farm entirely. My mother, sitting beside me at that table, began crying almost immediately, and I remember reaching over and holding her hand, because whatever I felt toward Roger in that moment, complicated and layered as it was, I understood clearly that my mother was losing something too, watching her only sibling admit, in a conference room in front of an attorney and a forensic document examiner, to forging their father's signature. She asked him, her voice breaking, how long he'd known about the trust before deciding to forge the document, and Roger admitted that he'd actually learned about it nearly 2 years earlier, having found paperwork in my grandfather's office by accident while looking for something else entirely, and had said nothing to anyone, including my grandfather, choosing instead to simply hope, for 2 years, that the situation would somehow resolve itself in his favor before it became urgent. That detail landed harder than almost anything else in that room. The 2 years of silence, because it meant Roger's forgery hadn't been a single desperate decision made in the immediate shock of grief. It had been the culmination of a plan he'd been quietly aware of and doing nothing to address honestly for 2 full years, watching my grandfather's health decline the entire time, knowing exactly what was coming, and choosing, when the moment finally arrived, to fake a signature rather than have an honest conversation with either his father or the rest of the family about how unfair he felt the arrangement was. I asked Paul, before the meeting ended, what the county attorney's office had indicated so far about how they intended to proceed, and he told us that based on preliminary conversations, given the forensic findings and Roger's own admission, prosecutors were likely to pursue a charge, probably forgery of a legal document, which in Iowa can be treated as a felony depending on the specifics. Though the ultimate charging decision and any potential plea arrangement would rest with the county attorney's office rather than with our family directly. Roger, upon hearing this, put his face in his hands for a long moment, and then said quietly that he understood and that he wasn't going to fight the county's process, that he'd rather take responsibility than drag the whole family through a longer legal battle contesting facts that were, at this point, no longer really in dispute. In the weeks that followed, the consequences unfolded exactly as concretely as these situations tend to. Once the truth is fully established and can no longer be managed through family silence or convenient timing. Roger was formally charged about 3 weeks later with forgery of a real estate instrument, a Class D felony under Iowa law given the value of the property involved. And after consulting with a criminal defense attorney, he ultimately entered into a plea agreement, pleading guilty to a reduced charge in exchange for a sentence that included probation, a substantial fine, and a formal restitution order covering the legal costs the estate had incurred investigating and responding to the forgery. Rather than active prison time, a resolution the county attorney's office indicated was influenced significantly by my written statement declining to push for the harshest available charge, and by Roger's own cooperation once confronted with the forensic findings. The farm equipment financing Roger had been quietly pursuing collapsed entirely once the fraud became public, since no lender was willing to extend credit against land whose ownership had just been the subject of a felony forgery case, and the modernization plans he'd been discussing with my mother a few months earlier never materialized. His marriage, which had already been under strain for reasons partly related to the family's ongoing financial pressure, did not survive the additional weight of a criminal case and the community fallout that followed, and he and his wife separated formally about 5 months after the plea agreement, a development I learned about secondhand through my mother rather than directly from Roger, since our own relationship remained, understandably, strained and largely silent in the immediate aftermath. Roger's standing in Larkspur, a small town where everyone had known the Voss family for generations, changed almost overnight in ways that were, I think, harder for him in some respects than the formal legal consequences. The co-op where he'd done business for over 20 years quietly shifted several of his standing arrangements to require upfront payment rather than the seasonal credit terms he'd relied on for most of his adult life. A change nobody explicitly explained, but that everyone involved understood clearly enough. Men he'd known his whole life at the implement dealer and the grain elevator grew noticeably cooler in their interactions with him, not hostile exactly, but distant in the particular way small towns handled disgrace, polite, correct, and unmistakably different from how they'd treated him even 6 months earlier. My cousins, Roger's 2 adult children, Kyle and Megan, handled the situation in strikingly different ways from each other. Kyle, the older of the two, essentially stopped speaking to his father for close to a year, telling me once, during a rare conversation we had at a mutual friend's wedding, that he felt like he'd spent his whole childhood being told his father was simply unlucky, a victim of bad markets and bad timing, and that discovering the forgery had forced him to reconsider almost every version of events he'd grown up believing. Megan, the younger of the two, took a gentler approach, maintaining Kant. Act with her father while also, at least according to what my mother told me, being fairly blunt with him about how much damage he'd done, not just legally, but to the trust the rest of the family had in him going forward. My mother's relationship with Roger has been, by far, the most complicated thread in the aftermath, because unlike me, she wasn't holding a legal document that clarified her own standing throughout this entire situation. She was simply watching her only sibling do something genuinely serious to their shared father's memory, while also still loving him as the brother she'd grown up with. She has continued to see Roger periodically in the time since, careful, limited visits, mostly centered around holidays, and she told me once, several months after the plea agreement, that she'd made a kind of peace with loving someone while also being deeply disappointed in them. A distinction she said she wished she'd learned to hold earlier in life, rather than discovering it so painfully at 68 years old. As for the farm itself, the trust's standing was formally confirmed without further contest once Roger's plea agreement made clear he wasn't going to challenge the legitimate 2012 trust document, and I became, as my grandfather intended 13 years earlier, the sole owner and steward of 340 acres that have been in our family since 1911. I want to be honest that stepping fully into that role has been more complicated than I expected, not legally, since Paul handled the transition smoothly once the criminal matter resolved, but emotionally, because inheriting land under these particular circumstances means the farm now carries both my grandfather's memory and the memory of watching my family nearly fracture entirely over it. I made a decision, about 2 months after everything had legally settled, to keep Roger involved in the farm's actual operations, at least for the current growing season, working as a paid farm manager under a formal contract rather than as an owner. A decision that surprised several people in the family, my mother especially, who worried I was setting myself up for further disappointment. I want to explain why I made that choice, because I think it matters for understanding what I was actually trying to build, rather than simply what I was trying to punish. Roger genuinely knows that land, every field, every drainage tile, every quirk of soil that shifts slightly from one 20-acre section to the next. Knowledge built over more than 3 decades of actual physical labor that I couldn't easily replace with someone unfamiliar with the property. Keeping him on, under clear, formal, well-documented terms, felt like the version of accountability that actually served the land itself, rather than simply serving my own sense of vindication. That arrangement has not been easy, and I won't pretend it has been. Our conversations remain more businesslike than they used to be, careful in a way that reflects exactly what happened between us, and I've had to learn to separate my role as the farm's owner making operational decisions from my role as a niece who is still, underneath everything, grieving a version of my family that existed before all of this came to light. Roger apologized to me directly, once, about 4 months after the plea agreement, sitting across from me at the same kitchen table where my grandfather had first told me about the trust 13 years earlier, and he said that he understood the apology probably meant very little given everything that had happened, but that he needed to say it anyway, out loud, specifically to me, rather than filtered through my mother or an attorney. I told him I appreciated him saying it, and that I believed he meant it, but that trust, real trust, would need to be rebuilt slowly, through consistent behavior over time, rather than restored by a single conversation, no matter how sincere. I also want to say something about Doris Kessler, the notary whose memory started all of this, because I don't think this story would have unfolded the way it did without her particular kind of quiet diligence. I drove out to meet her in person about 2 months after everything had settled, mostly just to thank her, and we sat in a small diner near the courthouse for almost 2 hours while she told me stories about my grandfather I'd never heard before, small moments from decades of him coming in for one piece of paperwork or another, a joke he'd told her nearly every single visit for 20 years about how his own handwriting teacher would be horrified, a habit he had of always asking about her grandchildren by name before getting down to whatever business had brought him in that day. She told me that in 31 years of notarizing documents, she'd caught maybe 4 or 5 attempted forgeries total, and that most notaries, she suspected, simply weren't paying close enough attention to catch them, that the job often gets treated as a formality rather than what it actually is, a genuine safeguard against exactly the kind of thing my uncle had tried to do. I think about that conversation with Doris often, because it reframes something for me about where real protection in situations like this actually comes from. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation or a clever legal maneuver on my part, or even, primarily, the trust document itself, though that document mattered enormously once the situation escalated. It was one woman's habit of paying close attention, built slowly over 3 decades of taking her work seriously, even when nobody was watching to see whether she did, that ended up being the single most important safeguard in this entire situation. More important, in some ways, than any of the legal paperwork Paul and I spent weeks assembling after the fact. I still go out to the farm most weekends, the same way I used to when my grandfather was alive, walking the same fence lines, checking the same tile drainage, standing in the same fields where he taught me to read soil and weather and the particular rhythms of a working farm. I planted a small memorial garden near the farmhouse this past spring, mostly perennials that will come back on their own year after year without much tending, because I like the idea of something on that land that would keep returning without anyone needing to force it. The way the land itself has kept returning to the people who actually cared for it, generation after generation, despite every effort along the way to divert it somewhere else. If there's one thing I've taken from all of this, it's that quiet, consistent care rarely gets celebrated the way dramatic gestures do, but it tends to be the thing that actually holds up under pressure when it matters most. Nobody threw a party for the years I spent driving out to that farm on weekends, learning its soil, showing up steadily while other family members made louder, more visible claims to the same legacy. But when the moment came that actually tested who had really been paying attention, to the land, to the paperwork, to the small details that define ownership and belonging, it was the quiet, consistent record, mine and Doris Kessler's both, that turned out to be the thing worth trusting. I don't think my family is unusual in the shape of what happened here, even though the specific details, a forged bill of sale, a notary with an extraordinary memory, a felony charge, are more dramatic than most people's version of this story. I think a lot of families carry some version of an imbalance like this. One person who shows up reliably and gets treated as though that reliability requires no particular protection, and another person who takes more and gives less and somehow still ends up positioned as the one who needs the most understanding. Recognizing that pattern while you're still inside it is difficult. Deciding you're allowed to protect what's actually yours, even when doing so risks real conflict with people you love, is harder still, and it rarely resolves as cleanly or as quickly as we might want it to. I didn't pursue any of this out of a desire for revenge, and I want to say clearly that even in the angriest moments of this whole process, sitting in that conference room watching my uncle admit to forging his own father's signature, revenge was never actually what I wanted. What I wanted, and what I ultimately got, was simply the truth, established clearly, on the record, in a way that couldn't be quietly rewritten by whoever told the story loudest or first. My grandfather spent 50 years building something real on that land, and he spent his final years quietly making sure it would end up in hands he trusted to keep building it honestly. I think, more than the acreage itself, that quiet trust was always the actual inheritance, and I intend to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of it, the same slow, patient way he spent his life earning the right to pass it on. If any part of this story felt familiar to you, if you've ever been the one quietly doing the real work while someone else tried to claim the credit, I hope tonight's story gave you something to sit with. Thank you for being here with me through this one. If you'd like more stories like this, go ahead and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.